Hello everyone, Donkey Storm here, bringing you a World of Warcraft dungeon guide aimed for newer players. This is the fourth guide in my beginners series, so if you enjoy it you may want to check out the other three. I'll link them in the description. So far we've gone over controls and UI, questing and leveling, and mounts and travel. Don't forget to sub so you know when I post more guides like this one. Today I'm going to go over some general tips to becoming a proficient dungeoneer and then look a little bit more closely at the three roles, DPS, healer, and tank. Your first experience playing with others can be a bit nerve-wracking, so I'm going to try and give you all the basic information I can to set you up for success. Alright, let's get into it. So how do you start? If you press I on your keyboard, you'll bring up the Dungeon and Raid tab. Great place to start is under Dungeon Finder and Random Dungeon. This will automatically group you up with other players looking to do the same type of dungeon as you and teleport you directly to the instance. No travel needed. When you finish, you'll be placed right back where you were when you left. I recommend starting doing dungeons as early as possible, which is level 15, to start getting to know how they work. They're much more forgiving at that level, so if you've got some anxiety about playing with others, just jump in. The sooner you begin learning and gaining experience, the more comfortable you'll be when stuff starts getting a little bit harder. Before you start mashing those buttons and getting fat loot, let's talk about your mindset going into a dungeon. Your goal should always be to help your group clear the dungeon as efficiently as possible. Obviously, chicks dig dudes at the top of the damage meters, but it's hard to top the meters when you're dead. Think of yourself as a cog in a well-oiled machine. You need to do everything your class is responsible for to make things run smoothly. That might mean sacrificing DPS to CC, interrupt, or perform mechanics. The second part of mindset is being open to learn. If you're a newer player, you're probably going to mess up a bit. That's okay, it happens to everyone. Try to learn from your mistakes and ask questions if you don't understand something. Don't be afraid to admit to others that you're learning. You'll actually find that saying so might turn some salty players into helpful teammates. Next thing we need to go over is positioning and awareness. This is one thing even experienced players mess up on a lot. Dungeons in WoW are often in enclosed spaces and you're usually looking at fighting packs of mobs instead of one at a time. Having your character in the right position to do your job is critical. Make sure you aren't too close to other packs that might accidentally pull, resulting in a wipe for your group. Allow yourself room to maneuver away from any mechanics you might have to dodge. Also make sure you're standing within line of sight of your healer so you don't die, or vice versa, healers need to stay in line of sight of their groups. Make sure to zoom your camera out as far as you're comfortable with, so you have a large field of vision to help you in making these decisions. There are also some really useful add-ons, such as deadly boss mods and Bigwigs, that can help warn you about incoming mechanics and what you'll need to do. I'm not usually too big on recommending add-ons to new players, but in my opinion, running one of these two is a must. I'll link them in the description below. The next item on the list is getting to know all of your character's abilities. When you're out questing and leveling, you'll likely use the same few damaging abilities over and over while killing mobs solo. Those are your main DPS abilities, but every class brings their own set of skills to the table, what we in the WoW community call utility. Here's an example. My Outlaw Rogue has a ton of utility. I have an ability called Tricks of the Trade, and I never use it while playing solo, but this ability redirects all threat to the target for 6 seconds on a 30-second cooldown. There's really no reason for me not to cast this on the tank at the beginning of large pulls to help them get aggro on mobs, keeping the rest of the group safe. Another example is Gouge. I rarely use this while playing solo, but in a group, this is a disorient that I can use as an extra stun, preventing mobs from channeling dangerous abilities. You're also going to want to become aware of your defensive abilities. My rogue has got a few. There's Crimson Vial, a small self-heal over time. There's Feint, which reduces area of effect damage by 40%. There's Cloak of Shadows, which makes me immune to all harmful spells for a short time. There's Riposte, which allows me to parry all incoming physical attacks for 10 seconds. Knowing when to use your defensive abilities is key and something you can really only learn through trial and error. But have these abilities at the ready. You can't always rely on your healer to bail you out of every situation on their own. So get to know all the abilities in your spellbook. This is one of the things that separates good players from average ones. Use the Dungeon Journal. Pressing Shift-J in-game brings up the Dungeon Journal. When you're in a dungeon, this will show you the dungeon's bosses, their abilities, and their loot. It's always a good idea to at least check the overview page for your role to see what important mechanics you need to know about in an upcoming encounter. Going into the Abilities tab will bring up a much more detailed overview of literally everything the boss can do. That can be a little bit overwhelming, but if you really need to know, that's where you can find it. So let's talk about the different roles in a dungeon group. There are 5 players in a dungeon group, 1 tank, 1 healer, and 3 damage dealers, or DPS. Let's focus on DPS first. Simply put, the job of DPS players is to output as much damage as possible without dying. If you don't like the idea of having other players' lives in your hands, although you still do to some extent, this may be a good place for you to start. If you want to be a good damage dealer, you need to learn your class's single and multiple target rotations and practice them to the point that you can do them with minimal effort and thinking, freeing you up to make sure that you're not taking avoidable damage and doing mechanics correctly in dungeons. You can easily find class guides on Google, or better yet, look up your class's Discord server for guides and to connect with other players. I'll drop a link to those in the description. In addition to dealing damage, a good DPS player can make his or herself extremely valuable by making good use of their class's utility. This could mean interrupts, stuns, crowd control, threat management, buffs, or battle reses. And to help your healer out, find out what defensive abilities your class has and use them when you think you're going to be taking lots of damage so they can focus their mana and spells on other players. Having high damage makes everyone's job easier. The tank takes less of a beating, the healer doesn't have to heal for as long, and the mobs die before doing too many dangerous abilities. Let's take a look at the healing role. I guess it goes without saying that a healer's main job is to make sure no one dies. Healers need to learn what situations to use their various healing spells in. For example, on my Restoration Druid, I generally keep Life Bloom and Efflorescence up all the time, and use Rejuvenation and Wild Growth when party members are taking light or moderate damage. These are low mana cost spells that generally keep party members topped off. If a single player is taking too much damage, I can use Regrowth or Swift Mend on them to get their health back up faster at a greater mana cost than my other spells. If things are really getting nasty, I can use a spell with a longer cooldown like Bark Skin for single target damage or Tranquility for large amounts of group damage. Healers are kinda like the battery of the group, and your ability to manage your mana without drinking is one of the main factors that determines how quickly a group can get through a dungeon. Healers also need to know who to prioritize when the going gets tough. Allowing yourself to die means the group will not receive any healing for the rest of the pool, likely resulting in a wipe. Allowing the tank to die means mobs will be attacking you or your squishy DPS friends, also likely resulting in a wipe. Healers need to prioritize keeping themselves and the tank alive to keep a pull going. Losing a DPS player can be rough and slow things down a lot, but not nearly as much as the whole group dying. So don't healers get to do any damage? Actually, one of the hallmarks of a good healer is their ability to keep their group alive and weave in some DPS to help speed things up. I'd recommend learning the ins and outs of your heals and what you can get away with before you attempt this though. As a healer, your DPS is nowhere near that of an actual DPS player, and you should never sacrifice your healing responsibilities for the style points of doing a little deeps. The main role of the tank is to soak damage for the group. Tanks want to have all the mobs at a given pull hitting them, and not other members of the group. Because of this, a tank's main focus is survivability. You want to be able to absorb all of this damage without giving your healer carpal tunnel trying to keep you alive. Tanks need to learn their basic damage rotation that allows them to maintain threat on mobs, which means how to keep them hitting you and not other people. They also need to learn how to balance their various defensive abilities to keep themselves alive. For example, my Protection Warrior has a Demoralizing Shout, a debuff that reduces enemies' damage dealt by 20%, Ignore Pain, which ignores up to 50% of damage taken, Shield Block, which blocks all incoming melee attacks for 6 seconds, Last Stand, which increases my health temporarily and heals me, and Shield Wall, which reduces all incoming damage by 40%. That's a lot of abilities, and a good tank player will know when to use which one to keep themselves up. I'll also preface this by saying that the gameplay you see here is my very rusty Prot Warrior and definitely not high level play. I'm hoping to just give you a taste of what tanking looks like, so please don't flame me over my bad tanking. In addition to just being a meat shield, tanks have other responsibilities too. Tanks are the ones who engage enemy mobs in combat, called pulling, and really set the pace of the dungeon for the group. A good tank will pull at a pace that allows their healer to have mana and keep the group alive. Tanks are also mostly responsible for positioning enemies in a way that's optimal for their group. For example, if an enemy has a big cleaving ability that hits everything in front of it, the tank will need to turn the mob around so its back is facing the group. Tanks also want to position groups of enemies in ways that allow the DPS to maximize their damage on them, which often means stacking them up so the DPS can AoE them down. If you like taking the reins of a group and leading them to victory, tank may be the role for you. That sure seems like a lot, and it is. And good for you for doing some prep to try and learn more about how to play in dungeons before starting. That's more than most players do. But like most things, the only way to really improve is to get out there and do it. You'll mess up, but as long as you're open to learning, you will improve over time. Remember to start at an early level when you have fewer abilities to keep track of and dungeons are more simple, if you can. I hope that you found the tips included in this guide helpful. For more beginner guides, check out my WoW Beginner Guide playlist, and for more World of Warcraft content, please help me out by subscribing to my channel so you can be updated when I add something new. This has been Donkey Storm. Now go forth and dungeon.